Hello, welcome back to Patterdox Civics, the rights and responsibilities of American citizenship. Today we're going to be talking about government manipulation. Manipulation is like controlling the actions. And this goes for the people controlling the government, but also the government controlling the people. So we're going to be kind of talking about that and getting into some controversial topics today. So let's get into it. So in the last class, I went into a lot of things that a typical government or a typical civics class would cover. So it's the three branches of government, what their jobs are and things. I kind of touched on some of the government manipulation stuff, but today, it's going to be the things that aren't covered. Patterdox Civics is going to be different than other civics classes. I mean, that's what sets Patterdox apart is there are things that are covered here that are not covered out there in a traditional school. And a lot of these things are controversial. And a lot of these things, you're not supposed to talk about. We have to talk about it because how government actually functions is often different from the way it's supposed to function. What the vision that the founding fathers had was great, but the way that it's playing out in modern society is not always aligned with what the founding fathers were thinking. So it's important to study that, and that's what we're going to be doing. The things I'm going to be talking about today are often not covered in a textbook, but it's the real deal. I'm pulling back the curtain a little bit. Okay, money. Money is the means that can be exchanged for, goods and services. Okay. So money is resources. And with resources, you can do a whole lot of things. You can buy a gold-plated yacht and jewelry, or you can buy government. Essentially, you can have control over government because money and resources can be distributed anywhere that you see fit. I mean, you can spend your money anywhere you want to, and you can buy a whole bunch of products, or you can buy influence because you can get people to do things that they might not want to do if you have money. And in politics, winning elections has a lot to do with money. How much money do you have? Because that money can then be used to go out and do marketing and build a good public relations campaign and all of those sorts of things. But going back to the very first elections, money played an important role. I mean, going back to the earliest elections, even just buying drinks for people would be oh, well, thank you for buying me a drink. What can I do for you? Yeah, just vote for me. All right, sounds good. So money has always played a role in elections and in getting people into positions of power. So this is nothing new, but there's always going to be ways to try and stop the money. And then it's almost like if there's a leaky bucket, right? And there's water spilling out. You put your thumb over the hole, then another one just springs open. And you put your thumb there and then another one springs open. Okay. That's kind of the way that money works. It'll always find a way to have influence because people want to have an influence over their government. People want to push for policies that they believe are good. People want to support their family and their businesses and things with government power. So this is inevitable. It's just the way it's going to be. So let's understand it. And then maybe when we deeply understand it, we can start to plug as many holes as possible or direct the water to where we want it to go because it's inevitable that it's going to be springing out somewhere. In the 1970s, there was Buckley versus Vallejo. That was a big Supreme Court case that was essentially saying that limits on campaign contributions was a violation of your First Amendment. Like your First Amendment, you can express yourself in the way you see fit, and that could be through money. So that was shut down. So essentially trying to limit contributions to campaigns. Then in the early 2000s, there was the McCain-Feingold bill, which was a way to limit money going to campaign ads. And from that, now when you watch a presidential campaign ad or something that says I am Donald Trump and I approve this message, or I am Joe Biden and I approve this message. That's from McCain-Feingold. But these were attempts to try and plug these different holes. And then in 2010, there was Citizens United versus the Federal Elections Commission. And with that came this idea that corporations could be seen as individuals and that corporate spending through the use of a super PAC could be unlimited. The details of this aren't really what matters. What I want you to know is that there have been many attempts to try and fix the issue of money in politics, and every time they fix one, they plug that hole, another one springs open. So one happens, another happens, another happens, and it's this issue of, shouldn't you be allowed to put your money wherever you want to put your money. Shouldn't you be able, if you want to have $1 million, you want to burn it like the Joker in Dark Knight, like you should be allowed to do that. But there's obviously dangers to you putting your money in a government that is then going to be in charge of making law and policy. So it's this weird kind of back and forth that we're always wrestling with. Lawrence Lessig is a professor at Harvard, and he talks a lot about how certain people in society have a whole lot of power over government, and most people in society have very little power in their government. So he talks about that inequity when it comes to, who the government listens to. Very rich, powerful people might have a senator on speed dial. They just call up the senator and call him, and then they get direct access, because one of the ways that you get a bill in Congress is you have to get it on the Congress floor or into a committee. So you have to get someone who is in Congress or in the Senate to present that. You can write to them, but they get thousands of letters a month or something. So are they going to actually listen to you? But if you are friends with them or you give to their campaign, then they're going to pick up your phone call right away. And if you have those people on speed dial, you can just call them right away. That gives you a disproportionate, larger say in what gets presented in our government than people that don't have that. And as I said, since the beginning, this has been an issue. This has always been an issue in election, and yet it gets brought up all the time. It gets brought up in debates all the time. Why is this still an issue? Because it's human nature. I mean, this is Patterdox. This is the pattern of human nature, is that going back to cavemen, the cavemen who had the most resources are going to have more of a say because they have that power. So this is just a human nature thing, and it's going to continuously be an issue. So we have to understand it and then try to find ways that we can get through this the best way possible. But aside from money, I have a question for you. Really, what is more valuable when you're trying to win an election? Is it money or is it influence? Because if I give $1 million to a candidate, what are they going to do with that $1 million? Probably they're going to buy a lot of campaign ads, right? Like they're going to put up signs, and they're going to put out mailers, and they're going to do a whole bunch of commercials and a social media campaign and hire interns to do all that to get the word out. I mean, that's really what it's about, is getting the word out, getting your message out. If you have influence, though, like an influencer, if you have influence, maybe that's more valuable than money itself. I mean, Rupert Murdoch, the guy that started Fox News, is just one person. So he's limited in how much he can donate to, say, like the Republican Party. But he can start Fox News and just run pro-Republican things around the clock on Fox News. I mean, which one's bigger? A couple $1,000s or even a couple $1 million to a campaign, or running a completely dedicated, channel to doing that campaign work? Like here's a hypothetical example. The Rock, like Dwayne Johnson, can't donate more than $2,800 to a particular candidate. Okay. And that number changes. It always goes up and over time, but let's say $2,800 to a candidate, but he can post about it on Instagram. Okay. So he has over 400 million followers on Instagram. Okay. What's the value of a post? Okay. If The Rock wants to promote your clothing ad, you make a cool t-shirt company. Okay. How much would you have to pay Dwayne Johnson to go on his Instagram and say, oh, The Rock loves these shirts. They're the best shirts ever. Like more than $2,800. That could be millions and millions and millions of dollars. So if The Rock goes on his Instagram and says, you should vote for this person, or I'm voting for this person, isn't that potentially more valuable than money? And this gets into some really tricky things, because then you could say like, well, isn't he allowed to share who he's voting for? I mean, we all have a social media platform. Some of us have more followers than others, but can't I say, well, I'm going to vote for this person and you shouldn't vote for that person? Like, that's freedom of speech. I should be allowed to use my platform to do that, right? But when you have a massive following, that can really swing elections. So this gets tricky. And in 2020, this wasn't a hypothetical. The Rock actually did. He used all of his channels and he went on and he supported Biden-Harris. And he said that he doesn't get political very often, but he's throwing his hat into the ring for this side. And then he did a Q&A with them. Now, he didn't maybe give directly money, but did that have an influence? I mean, probably. I don't know how many people are going to listen to The Rock when it comes to their political stances and who they're voting for, but there is value in him endorsing something, obviously. So this happens, and this is something that maybe our founding fathers didn't think about, like how much influence some people could have. Maybe there were newspapers and things like that, but not the same as social media. It's very difficult to build like a whole newspaper. But for some people, it's very easy to develop a massive following on social media. You know, they just could have one TikTok go viral, and then all of a sudden they have a whole bunch of followers, and then they have a whole bunch of influence, and that influence can be used to influence an election. Now, going back to what I was talking about with Lawrence Lessig, there's a video I want to show you from Represent Us about how corruption is legal in America. Okay, it's a really interesting video about how certain people have massive influence over the government and other people have very little. So check this video out.
For the last few years, I've had this sense that everything I learned as a kid about how America's government works is completely wrong. But I had no idea how bad things actually were until I saw this one graph. Researchers at Princeton University looked at more than 20 years worth of data to answer a pretty simple question. Does the government represent the people? Now, this is what they found. This axis here represents public support for any given idea. On the left, at 0%, are ideas that not a single American wants. On the right, at 100%, are ideas that everyone supports. This axis represents the likelihood of Congress passing a law that reflects any of these ideas, from a 0 to a 100% chance. On this graph, an ideal republic would look like this. If 50% of the public supports an idea, there's a 50% chance of it becoming law. If 80% of us support something, there's an 80% chance. You get the idea. Now, most Americans would probably agree that, with a few exceptions, we should be as close to this ideal as possible. Unfortunately, the way America actually works doesn't even come close. Take an idea that nobody supports, literally nobody, and it has about a 30% chance of becoming federal law. Now, take an incredibly popular idea, the most popular idea this country has ever seen, and there's also about a 30% chance of it becoming law. This means that the number of American voters for or against any idea has no impact on the likelihood that Congress will make it law. Put another way, and I'm just going to quote the Princeton study directly here, the preferences of the average American appear to have only a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact upon public policy. So if you've ever felt like your opinion doesn't matter and that the government doesn't really care what you think, well, you're right. But there's a catch. This flat line only accounts for the bottom 90% of income earners in America. Economic elites, business interests, people who can afford lobbyists, they get their own line. Look at how much closer their line is to the ideal. When they want something, the government is much more likely to do it. And when they don't, they have the power to completely block it from happening, no matter how much the rest of the country supports it. They get what they want, and guess who ends up paying for it? We pay for it with the most expensive healthcare in the world. We pay for it with a tax code that's a complete mess. We pay for it with internet that's slower and more expensive, with wasteful spending, a floundering education system, a catastrophic drug war, and 1 in 5 American children born into poverty. Almost every major issue we face as a nation can be traced back to this graph. How does this happen? Well, just follow the money. Right now, it's perfectly legal to buy political influence in America. Here's how it works. Let's say a big bank wants a law that would force taxpayers to bail them out again if they repeat the exact same reckless behavior that crashed the global economy in 2008. Not exactly the most popular idea with the public, and Congress knows that. That should be the end of it. But that's where the money comes in. It's perfectly legal for our bank to hire a team of lobbyists whose entire job is to make sure that the government gives the bank what it wants. Then those lobbyists can track down members of Congress who regulate banks and help raise a ton of money for their re-election campaigns. It's perfectly legal for those lobbyists to offer those same politicians million-dollar jobs at their lobbying firm. Then, those lobbyists can literally write the language of this new bailout law themselves and hand it off to the politician they just buttered up with campaign money and lucrative job offers. And it's perfectly legal for those politicians to take the lobbyist-written language and sneak it through Congress at the last second. So now you've got a law that greatly benefits the banks, and the whole process can start over. This is how a bill becomes a law. A special interest hires some lobbyists, those lobbyists collect campaign contributions, offer jobs, and then write the laws that Congress then passes to help those same special interests. This happens every day on every single issue with politicians of both parties. In the last 5 years alone, the 200 most politically active companies in the United States spent $5.8 billion influencing your government. Those same companies got $4.4 trillion in taxpayer support, and that's trillion, with a T. And that's just the top 200 companies. Never mind every other special interest, every union, every trade association, and every billionaire. Every single one of them can use their money to buy political influence. You know, there's this idea out there that this only became a problem after the Supreme Court's Citizens United decision in 2010. But the data goes back almost 40 years, and the results are clear. Corruption is legal in America. And as long as it is, anyone who can spend money to buy political influence will.
Okay, so that is our reality, right? Like our reality is that we would want, ideal representation would be if people are supportive of a topic, then that would be a topic that would get addressed. And then if people are supportive of a policy, then that policy would be implemented. If people are not supportive of a policy, that policy would not get implemented. But that's just not the way it works, because people are self-interested. They also have ideologies. They say that these are policies that I believe in, and if I have extra swing and extra say, then I'm going to try and get those policies implemented. Even if they're not good for everybody, if they're good for me or good for what I believe is good, then those people have a disproportionate say by a lot. But we're just not talking about rich people. It's not just individuals like The Rock or, some rich hedge fund manager or something like that. It's not just people. It's also corporations. Corporations, business entities, okay, that are separate from the individual. It's its own entity. Okay, so if they do something wrong, let's say, and they're sued, the individual is not liable, it's the corporation. If you slip and fall at Walmart, you don't sue the Walton family, you sue Walmart Corp. You go after the corporation, and then the Walton family is kind of like safe. If a Tesla crashes, you don't sue Elon Musk, you sue Tesla. Now, corporations have a lot of the same rights as citizens do, which is interesting. But there's one thing that I want you to really know, and I used to have my class just repeat this over and over and over again. What is the goal of a corporation? In a previous class, I asked are you a good person? And it's like, what's the goal of a person? Or what's the mission? What's the meaning? What's the purpose? What's the purpose of a person? And I said, what's the purpose of a stapler? What's the purpose of a pillow? What's the purpose of a corporation? Well, a corporation has one goal, and that is to raise shareholder value. It's not even necessarily make money. It's definitely not to serve. You might want to serve. You might want to make a great product at a great price. But all of that is just to raise shareholder value, to get the value of that company up. Okay. A corporation has shares. So it's like parts. And then you could sell out the parts. You could keep all the parts for yourself. But share is like you have a share. You have a piece of that company. You want those pieces to grow. You want to grow the value of the company. That's it. That is the goal of a corporation, to raise shareholder value. That's it. Understand that, okay? If Nike does a whole ad about social justice, it's not because they care about social justice. Individuals at Nike might care about social justice, okay? But really, it's because they believe that will increase the value of Nike Corp. That's why Nike makes their decision. That's why every company, left, right, center, doesn't matter. Job of a corporation is to raise shareholder value. And once you understand that, then you can start to see the actions of corporations way more clearly. Now, one of the problems here is that corporations have an infinite growth model, okay? Which means that if you have the highest shareholder value in history of this corporation and you're popping champagne, you're like, oh my gosh, the value is so high, yay, 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 yay. Awesome, congratulations, you're all high-fiving, record profits, record shareholder value. What happens next quarter? Is it cool to all right, let's just chill here. Let's just keep at this value, If Apple stock or Tesla or Amazon, they hit the peak, they hit the height, is let's just chill here for a year or two. Is it okay if hey, we hit the highest, so it's okay to go down a little bit? No. You got to keep going up. You have to keep going up. You have to keep increasing. It's infinite growth. Infinite growth. How is that sustainable? How can you grow forever? I mean, in the natural world, what do they call an organic growth that grows forever? It's a cancer. That's what cancer is. Cancer just keeps growing until it takes over your whole body. Okay. So how is this sustainable? Well, you have to start cutting corners. You do whatever you can to keep that number going up. And that's where you can get into some really sticky situations because the pressure is on. Just because you have, 10 wins in a row doesn't mean that it's okay to lose the 11th game. You got to win the 11th game too. So the pressure's on to keep that infinite growth going. And you can start leaning into doing things that you might say would normally be immoral, but the pressure is so great to keep that infinite growth going. Well, one of the ways to keep this infinite growth going is to do mergers, bringing two corporations together, buying them out, or acquisitions, taking one over. Okay. So there are these massive funds like BlackRock and Vanguard, and they own like kind of everything. If you just like Google the companies that these funds like BlackRock and Vanguard own, they own kind of everything. Okay. And they own tech companies, and they own media companies, and they own pharmaceutical companies. They own all these different companies, and they're all under the one umbrella of this fund. Okay. And you can buy into that fund. And then when all these companies go up, then the growth goes up. So that's one way to get an infinite growth. Okay. But when they own all these different companies or large portions of these companies, then they're going to use those companies to work together. It's like in entertainment. If a media company owns a whole bunch of magazines, a whole bunch of movie studios, and a whole bunch of television channels, then what they're going to do is they're going to make a movie in the movie studio, and then they're going to talk about how great that movie is in the magazines, and they're going to bring the actors on the television channels to promote the movie. They all kind of work together, and that's how these funds work. So they're going to use one company to help another company to help another company so that the value continuously goes up. So it's not just buying them, but it's always trying to grow that value. And look, like this isn't necessarily all bad because you can buy into this. If you have a 401k or something, you're just a regular, working 9-to-5 person in middle America, you have a 401k that's in an index fund, or you can invest in one of these funds. And then as the infinite growth goes up, that's your retirement plan. So millions of people are relying on this infinite growth for their retirement plan. So I'm not saying it's all bad, but I'm saying that there are bad elements and we should at least understand the way it works. Let me ask you, how do you get the information about what's happening in the world? Like, where do you get this? The news, right? Like news media, whether that's on your phone or, typically it would be like on television. Television news channels is how you get your information. Okay. Well, I'm going to play you a video here. And I want to know, does this compromise the information being given? Because if the media channels, the news channels are owned by the same companies that also own other companies, then can the news channel accurately report news on those companies? Like Jeff Bezos, he owns Whole Foods, or Amazon owns Whole Foods. Okay. Well, he also owns the Washington Post. Okay. And owns Amazon. If a story comes out about how Amazon is treating its employees terribly, or Whole Foods has poison in its produce or something, will the Washington Post report on that? Now, Jeff Bezos would say, of course, I don't want to get, my personal bias involved or whatever, but it's bad for the Washington Post to report on that. So when you turn on your television and you're watching the news, you're not paying for that directly. You might pay for cable, but you're not paying directly to that news station. That news anchor is getting paid a lot of money. How do they get that money? From ads. They get advertisements. Well, the companies that are paying you for advertisements, if you report negatively on that, like they're paying your salary. So here's the video.
Good Morning America is brought to you by Pfizer.
CBS Health Watch sponsored by Pfizer.
Anderson Cooper 360. Brought to you by Pfizer.
ABC News Nightline. Brought to you by Pfizer.
Making a difference. Brought to you by Pfizer.
CNN Tonight. Brought to you by Pfizer. Early Start. Brought to you by Pfizer. Friday night on Aaron Burnett Out Front. Brought to you by Pfizer.
This week with George Stephanopoulos is brought to you by Pfizer.
This Weather Report brought to you by Pfizer.
Today's countdown to the royal wedding is brought to you by Pfizer.
And now CBS Sports Update brought to you by Pfizer. Meet the Press. Data download. Brought to you by Pfizer.
This portion of CBS This Morning sponsored by Pfizer. On how to find the hidden sugars in the American family diet. Sponsored by Pfizer.
Okay, so looking back, okay, this isn't just like knocking, these pharmaceutical companies, but if there was something negative going on within these pharmaceutical companies, if these news channels are brought to you by those companies, how are they going to report on that? And you can look up like the biggest lawsuits in the history of this country are against the pharmaceutical industries. Okay. These big pharma companies have killed lots of people, willingly, knowingly done it, and then got caught and had to pay out billions and billions of dollars. So they have a history of doing terrible things. They do wonderful things too. They keep grandma alive. You get your penicillin, you get all kinds of good medication and stuff, but they also do terrible things. You know, some of the lawsuits like Vioxx and drugs like that are really, really horrific. And how are you going to find out about it if they're paying the news channels salaries? You know, there's a great Upton Sinclair quote that's something along the lines of, it's very difficult for a man to believe something when his paycheck, when his salary hinges on him not believing it. But you know what? We're not in traditional school. We can talk about some of these off-limit topics, okay? And some of these are very, very controversial. So let's converse about it, you know, because there's nothing off limits when it comes to being curious. Be curious about everything. Ask questions about everything. Anytime that you are punished for being curious, that is not a learning environment. A learning environment is, let's hear it. What are you curious about? Let's talk about it. Okay, this headline, Pfizer to become a $100 billion behemoth next year thanks to COVID-19 drug and vaccine. All right, so $100 billion seems like a lot of money for this vaccine. Are you incentivized to make money? Again, Pfizer, do they want to cure people? Sure. Maybe, but really what they want to do is raise shareholder value because they're a corporation. I mean, you can see the graphs, like profits going up. And then when you take these massive profits going up, and then you look at the history, as I said about Vioxx, this Tom Nessie book is unbelievable about what pharmaceutical companies did with this drug that they knew was dangerous. They knew was killing people. They found out that it was killing something, I forget the number, something like 60,000 people. And after they got the report that it was killing all these people, they invested more money in promoting that drug, knowing it was killing people, than Budweiser spent promoting beer. That's shocking, and it's true. I highly recommend John Abramson's book, Sickening. It's all about how the pharmaceutical companies basically control how all the testing gets done, the influence that they have over policy. It's really, really startling. And we need to understand, again, I'm not just vilifying pharmaceutical companies. I'm saying that they are just doing what they're supposed to do. Pharmaceutical companies or corporations, they're supposed to just raise shareholder value. It's up to us. It's up to the government to be aware of this and do something about it. But when you start paying attention, then what happens is you start to lose trust. You know, gaining trust is so important, especially when it comes to like our government and institutions that have positions of power and stuff, is we need to trust them, okay? The powerful entities that are having control over your life, it's important that you trust them. I mean, that's fundamental to the ideas of America. The head of the NIH, Francis Collins, said, essentially, you know, how do we fight COVID? He said, all we can do to fight COVID-19 is vaccines, boosters, social distance, and masks. And that same sentiment was also echoed by Albert Bourla, who was a CEO of Pfizer. Well, that's not true. That's not all you can do. You can get a better cardiovascular system by regular exercise. You can look at the alignment between negative COVID results and like something like the average of 4 comorbidities or obesity. You could lose weight. You also, the connection between vitamin D, you could supplement with vitamin D. You know, my doctor at the time asked the same thing. I was like, what can I do to help, prevent, getting COVID or having negative COVID results? And he said the same thing, but I was like, wouldn't exercise be good? And he's like, well, yeah, I guess exercise. I was like, isn't vitamin D supplementation good? He's like, yeah, I guess that too. I mean, there's a lot of things you can do. There's a lot, but some of them are aligned with making a lot of money for pharmaceutical companies and some of them aren't. I think there's a lot of nuance here. Football player Aaron Rodgers was kind of vilified because he was talking openly about how the team was segregated between the vaccinated and unvaccinated. And the unvaccinated were vilified and said that they were bad. The vaccinated were doing the right thing. There was a lot of messaging going out from our government and different media organizations saying that, how the people who get the vaccine are good people and the people who don't get the vaccine are bad people. But it's more nuanced than that. Okay, you could be a very healthy person that did a whole bunch of other like prophylactic things and have, some immunity against or some resistance against COVID. Also, other countries did it different. They had, more access to testing. If you had COVID and you were coming out of it, you had COVID like 3 or 4 months ago, you could show evidence that, you have a better immunity to that strain of COVID than even the spike protein from the vaccine would give you. So why do you need to get vaccinated if you have an immunity? The hashtag natural immunity was blocked on social media platforms for over 2 years, but that goes back to the basics of medicine. We know that from chickenpox. You get chickenpox one time, and then you never get it again. That's kind of the way that it works. So why would the hashtag natural immunity be blocked on social media platforms unless they didn't want people to think well, I have an immunity here, so I'm not going to get the vaccine? Are they just trying to sell vaccines? Maybe. Are they worried about the dangers of just saying oh, I'm fine now because I got it before, I have natural immunity? Maybe. How many people die in a car crash because of their seatbelt? Not wearing a seatbelt. I'm saying they're wearing a seatbelt and then the car goes into a pond and they drown, or the car lights on fire and the buckle melts and they die because they're wearing their seatbelt. Some is the answer. Some people die because they're wearing a seatbelt. Now, most people survive because they're wearing a seatbelt, but should you be allowed to talk about the people that die by wearing a seatbelt, or is that just too dangerous for society? That's the question that I would have for you. But if you block any kind of voice that says, you know what, seatbelts sometimes kill people, if you shut them down and then people find out that you shut them down, that breaks trust. Because the reality is some people die because they're wearing a seatbelt. I'm not telling you not to wear a seatbelt. I'm not telling you not to get the vaccine or to get the vaccine. That's not my job. My job is to say, here's what is true. Make up your mind for yourself. And when certain narratives and certain truths are blocked, are censored from society, then people go, well, I don't know what to believe anymore. I don't trust them. I look at the history of these companies and the lawsuits and everything like that. I just don't trust them. I'm not going to get my information from them. And then we're all getting our information from different places, and it leads to a very dangerous, fractured society. So money in the American system corrupts the American system. We know that to be true. So when that corruption happens and certain institutions or corporations or people get too powerful, they need to be regulated by the government. That's the function of government, is to protect people's life, liberty, and property. Okay, that's the job of government. Okay, someone tries to take your life, the government stops them. Please come, you're trying to murder you. Okay, someone's trying to take your liberty, kidnapping, illegal, bad, to stop it. Trying to take your property, stealing stuff, bad, stop it. That's the job of government, is to protect your God-given, your natural rights, as John Locke would say, your natural rights. Okay, so that is the job of government. But what is happening is something called regulatory capture, which is one of these topics that is barely covered, if covered at all, in a traditional government or civics class. So this is the definition of regulatory capture. Regulatory capture is an economic theory that says regulatory agencies may come to be dominated by the industries or interests they are charged with regulating. The result is an agency charged with acting in the public interest instead acts in ways that benefit incumbent firms in the industry it is supposed to be regulating. So what does that mean? It means you're supposed to be making sure that this entity, that this corporation, let's say, or this industry does not act in bad ways. And then they help fund you. They give you money. They give you power. They have control over you. So now you are more beholden to what they want and not what is good for the public, what is good for the citizens to protect their rights and their life, liberty, and property. So here's an example. 75% of the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, drug division funding comes from big pharma. So big pharmaceutical companies fund the FDA. The FDA is who decides, is this drug safe? Is this drug legitimate? Is this going to hurt people? The funding for that agency comes from the companies that they're supposed to be regulating. That's real. And that's obviously a conflict of interest. Just like going back to the news station. If you are brought to you by a company and that company is doing something bad, do you just not look over there? You don't report on it because then you're going to lose your job? I'm not saying that this is guaranteed to cause corruption, but common sense would say it is a conflict of interest and potentially, to say the least, potentially dangerous. But this is a pervasive issue, okay? The Secretary of Defense, okay, is a guy named Lloyd Austin. He was a decorated general. But before he was the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of Defense is the person who is in the presidential cabinet who advises the president on what to do militarily. Okay, before he was that, okay, as like a retired general, he was on the board of Raytheon. Okay, he was one of the directors of Raytheon. Raytheon is a weapons company. It's a missile company. So now the guy who used to be at the very top of a missile company is right next to the president that is advising him on when to use and when to sell missiles. Is that maybe a conflict of interest? That all of his friends back at his company are going to make billions of dollars if they use these missiles? And then the president says, so Secretary Austin, should we use missiles? Look, you would probably do the same thing. If you have a family business, okay, and you have influence over the president, you have a family pizza shop. Okay, and the president says, hey, we have to get pizza into every school in America. What pizza shop should we use? My family pizza shop. Or we need to get food into every school in America. What food should we use? Pizza. Like, why wouldn't you do that? Of course you would do that. Okay, this is just human nature. But the problem is human nature needs to be regulated. And that's the job of the government. Because human nature might be, I'm just going to, you have something nice. I'm just going to take your stuff. You're annoying me. I'm just going to kill you. And we can't have that in a society. Another example is Dick Cheney. Dick Cheney was the vice president under George W. Bush. He also was the CEO of a company called Halliburton. Now, Dick Cheney was very instrumental in going into Iraq, okay, dropping a lot of bombs on Iraq and going into that war. And then when they wanted to rebuild Iraq, Halliburton, his company, got the no-bid contract. So Halliburton got billions of dollars to go rebuild the nation that he said needed to be rebuilt. I mean, did Dick Cheney know that his company or his former company is going to make billions of dollars when he decided to go into Iraq? I don't know, but it was good for his company. So, I mean, you can look at it. And here's another example. And again, this goes across Democrats and Republicans. This is not a partisan thing. But Janet Yellen, who is the United States Treasury Secretary, was paid massive amounts of money to do speaking engagements at like Goldman Sachs and Citigroup and all these Wall Street, big banks. Now, why would she get paid so much money to come talk? She's not Dave Chappelle. She's not that interesting to talk to. Okay, why? I don't know, perhaps that if you pay her a lot of money and then she's in charge of regulating banks and it could have something to do with it, right? I mean, just following common sense, it appears to be the possibility of regulatory capture. I mean, let's just make sense of this. Okay, let's look at like a school election or something like that, okay? Or like a local election, okay? In a local election, if you give a whole lot of money to someone and then they become mayor, you probably won't get a speeding ticket or a parking ticket. You're like, hey, I know the mayor. The mayor's like, give him a break. Like that kind of stuff happens. That's like the way it works. Like, oh, that's my friend. Well, it's cool. We'll give you a pass. That works across the board all the time. And it works like if you work at a ice cream shop and your friend comes in, you'll give them a little extra scoop because they helped you with your homework or something. But then what happens when you're not working at an ice cream shop? You're working at the White House, Like that's the way I want you to think about it. And you can look at it like, all right, well, I'm just going to play in this system. I'm going to take the money from these big donors or from these corporations, and then I'm going to get in a position of power, and then I'll close that loophole. I don't know. I don't know if that really happens. A lot of people say that you got to play the system if you want to actually be competitive. So you got to take these big donor funds and stuff like that. But then once I get to that position, I'm going to close that. Probably not. Now you owe all these favors, I just don't see that as common as people might think. I'm going to play this game. It's a rigged game, but I'm going to play the corruption game just to get into this position of power to bring about the change. By that point, by the time you get there, you owe so many favors that you might not change it. Like hooking people up, not that kind of hookup, like hooking people up. Like I'm gonna give you an extra scoop of ice cream, and then you work at the car wash, you'll give me a free wax or whatever. Like that's just the way it works. That like quid pro quo of people on all levels of society is just the way it works. And when you are high up on that hierarchy of society, you just have bigger favors and more power, and the power that you have, you will distribute to the things that you believe are best. And that could be just like directly to your friends and family. I mean, more on this cozy relationship between corporations and government is former government like experts and government employees end up working for corporations. I mean, including like people who are spies for the government end up working for big corporations like Amazon. So like they learn how to like tap phones and listen in on conversations and stuff. And then they're in charge of programming Alexa. Like it's interesting, this relationship. If you get a job high up in government and then you can get a job high up in corporations because you have all these skills and the same skills that the government uses, you can use in the corporation. I mean, it's just very commonplace. This guy, Sam Bankman-Fried, is a criminal, okay? But when he was running his like crypto empire, he was, I think, the second biggest donor to the Democratic Party. How was he able to get away with so much crime for so long? Maybe because he was giving massive amounts of money to the government, and the government are the ones who pursue, who they decide who are they going to be looking at, who are they going to try and prosecute, and things along those lines. So this is kind of everywhere, and you should really be aware of it. It's not covered nearly enough in government classes. The way this plays out a lot is in lobbying. Okay, so the intention of lobbying is people in positions of government. Okay, that could be like a state senator or a state representative. It could be a United States congressman. It could be a president. It could be a lot of different things. Okay. Is they can't be an expert on everything. So they have people come and give them information. And then part of their job is to be discerning and judicious about, let me hear your side. Let me hear your side. Okay, I'm going to decide then what is best for my constituency, for the American people, what have you. Okay, so the job of lobbying is you can go and talk to these representatives and give them information that can steer them one way or the other. Now, that's the way that it's supposed to work. But a lot of times it just is through donations and money and basic like bribery. Even though it's not like on its front bribery, you can bribe people with a whole bunch of different things like jobs and opportunities, just like how money doesn't just go for just cash, it goes for influence. Like there's always going to be loopholes. Lobbying is a special interest group. Okay, so it's a group that you want policy to help that group to get what its desired outcomes are. So it could be something like Mothers Against Drunk Driving. They raised the drinking age because mothers lost their children to drunk driving accidents. So they lobbied the government to raise the drinking age to lower drunk driving. It could be a whole bunch of things. It could be pharmaceutical companies, it could be real estate companies, farming, military tech, whatever it is if you have a business or a family business, or you could have just an individual and you want to change policy, you can go and lobby the government. Well, who can afford to do that? People with a lot of money. Okay, pharmaceutical industry has over 1,500 lobbyists. Now, there's 535 members of both houses of Congress. That means there's 3 full-time lobbyists for every 1 person in Congress. That's a lot of influence that they have over people, where alternative medicines, holistic medicines, how many lobbyists do they have? Maybe none. So all the information that the people in government are getting are from one side, and that's going to steer them. They have information only from one side and not really from the other. Then they're going to tend to vote along with the person that's giving them information they have cozy relationships with. But this graphic from Represent Us really shows how this works. Is you can't directly bribe, but what you can do is promise a job that pays like way more than it probably should, okay, when you get out. So you're a congressman, okay, you push some policy that helps a certain company, okay, and then when you leave after 2, 6, 12, whatever years, you get a job with that company for a really high salary that you were kind of promised, okay? And then you can go be a lobbyist for your former friends and colleagues in Congress. I mean, this is like a revolving door of corporations, then government, then corporations, and there's so much money and power going around, and that is just corporations acting like corporations, and government really run by people, just adults. They're adults, and adults are all corruptible. We're all corruptible to some degree, and we're all just going to be serving our best interests and the interests that we think are best. The people who the NRA, goes and lobbies. I don't know if someone's like really anti-gun. All of a sudden the NRA gives them some donations. All of a sudden they flip their stance on guns. I think they go to people that already have that lean. I don't think people just completely change based on this, but it does slant them a little bit more in one direction. But more on government manipulation is the powers that are in power, so it's the Democrats and Republicans, they want to keep it the Democrats and Republicans. In 1992, there was a billionaire named Ross Perot who was polling high enough to get onto the debate stage. So there are actually 3 people on the debate stage, and it really disrupted things. Bill Clinton got in when he probably wouldn't have gotten in because of Ross Perot. So the Democrats and Republicans came together and they raised the requirements to get a third-party candidate on the debate stage, okay? Because it's easy just to have one enemy. One enemy. You have the Republicans as the enemy, or you have Democrats as the enemy. And if you open it up to a whole bunch of political parties, which is definitely more democratic, then it kind of disrupts the system. So the Democrats and Republicans agree to keep it to a 2-party system. And one of the ways that they do this is through gerrymandering, okay? Again, Democrats and Republicans, they believe that they have the best ideas, but gerrymandering is redrawing state boundaries so that there are easy elections, okay? So the state legislatures redraw the boundaries. You have to have a certain number of people, but it doesn't say which people exactly. Like you're not allowed to do it based on race, but you can do it based on a whole bunch of other things. So they redraw the district lines to work around certain neighborhoods and include other neighborhoods so they have easy elections. And then that leads to you winning more elections and then getting in the state legislature, and then you can redraw the lines again to help your party more and more and more. So this is limiting the say in the people and getting easy wins for your team. Okay, like you can see in Pennsylvania's 7th district where it was in 1962 compared to 2002 and then 2011. It's the same number of citizens, or roughly the same number of citizens, but the shape changes because they include this neighborhood and exclude that neighborhood so they don't have close elections. And this is gerrymandering, something that both Democrats and Republicans do, okay? And it's a way to manipulate government manipulating itself to get what it wants. And that's not what the American people want. The American people do not want gerrymandered districts. I mean, look at some of the shapes of this. It's not because of like natural boundaries or anything like that. These are just like a lot of times in like landlocked states, it's just working around to make a really odd shape so that they have easy wins. And this is something that's gotten worse over time, is the government choosing who gets to vote. Instead of the people choosing the representatives, it's the representatives choosing the people. And that's a problem, and that's manipulation as well. Look, remember, those in power want to stay in power, okay? Not because they're evil, but because they believe that they know what's best, okay? So gerrymandering is definitely part of that. In 2020, evolutionary biologist Brett Weinstein started something called Articles of Unity, and it was a whole process to try and recruit people to run against Donald Trump and Joe Biden. And it was started on Twitter, and it was a social media campaign, and it was blocked. And you can see here, Twitter suspended Unity 2020's account for amplifying "Just Say No to Donald and Joe." Okay, so blocked for saying, let's have a third party. Now, why would Twitter not want a third party to be viable? Well, perhaps it's because both the Democrats and the Republicans don't want a third party. They want one enemy. It's easy to make that person look like the enemy, but to make all of these other people, it's a problem. And America's Constitution is not saying that we should have a 2-party system. There's nothing about a 2-party system in the American Constitution. You can start your own party. You can run for president, okay? But it is shut down by these corporations. Like, for example, at the time, the Twitter was owned by not Elon Musk. So it was run in a different way that did limit speech a lot more. Mark Zuckerberg was open about talking how the government was putting a lot of pressure on him to silence certain things about COVID, certain things about one political party. Okay. He says like he capitulated. He kind of bent the knee and said, okay, I'll just listen to the government, because there's corporations influence over government. Okay, we covered that. But there's also the government influence over corporations. You don't listen to us, we're going to audit you. We're going to come after you. You don't want the government coming after you. So the manipulation works both sides. It's important that you know that. It's this weird relationship of corporations and government having influence over each other. And that is often at the expense of the American people. So this covered the basics. I mean, I'm just scratching the surface of this kind of government corruption manipulation stuff, but there'll be resources in your resource folder that you can dive into. And I think that I just want you to get curious and really become a little healthy cynicism, okay, a little cynical about what's actually happening in government. And unfortunately, it's not the way that the textbook says. I hope this was interesting. Thank you so much. I'll see you next class.